Nobody knew that in exactly 10 minutes, one man's decision would determine whether Britain would survive or fall to Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill sat alone in his underground bunker, the wake of an entire empire crushing down on his shoulders. The phone call he was about to make would either save millions of lives or doom them all. It was May 1940, and Britain stood completely alone against the most powerful war machine in human history. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. Poland had been crushed in 28 days, and now Hitler's unstoppable Wehrmacht was gathering just 21 miles across the English Channel. Every military advisor, every politician, even his closest friends were telling Churchill the same thing. Surrender now, save what's left of Britain, negotiate with Hitler while you still can. The bunker felt like a tomb, buried 50 feet beneath London's streets. Maps covered every wall, showing red arrows pointing directly at London from every direction. German U-boats controlled the Atlantic, German bombers owned the European skies, and German tanks had rolled through every capital, from Warsaw to Paris. Logic demanded surrender. Mathematics screamed defeat. Common sense begged for negotiation. But Churchill stared at the red telephone on his desk, knowing that the next words he spoke would echo through history forever. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the crushing responsibility of 60 million British lives depending on his next decision. The cigar between his fingers had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in the weight of this impossible moment that would define the fate of Western civilization. The generals had just left his office with their final report, and their words still rang in his ears like a death sentence. Britain had lost almost all its equipment at Dunkirk. 300,000 men saved, but they came home empty-handed, without tanks, without artillery, without hope. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered 4-1 by the Luftwaffe. The Royal Navy couldn't stop a full-scale invasion across multiple landing points. And the British Army had enough ammunition for exactly 14 days of sustained fighting. But something burned in Churchill's eyes that night, something his enemies would soon learn to fear with every fiber of their being. Because what happened in those next 10 minutes didn't just change the war, it changed the entire course of human civilization. The old man who had been written off as a warmonger, dismissed as yesterday's politician, was about to prove that sometimes one voice of defiance can shake the foundations of tyranny itself and inspire the world to rise up against oppression.
The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight with mechanical precision, each second feeling like an eternity as the fate of democracy hung in the balance. Churchill's private secretary knocked on the door, her voice trembling as she reminded him that Lord Halifax was waiting for his answer about the peace negotiations with Hitler. The Prime Minister had to choose right now, fight alone against impossible odds and probably die as free men, or surrender and definitely live under Nazi rule, but live as slaves for generations to come. Churchill's mind raced back to his childhood, to the stories his nanny had told him about British heroes who faced impossible odds throughout the centuries. Nelson at Trafalgar, Wellington at Waterloo, Drake facing the Spanish Armada with nothing but courage and determination. Every one of them had been outnumbered, outgunned, and told to surrender by reasonable men who valued survival over honor. Every one of them had refused. And every one of them had changed the world forever. But this was different. This wasn't just about Britain anymore. Hitler's empire stretched from the frozen Arctic Ocean to the warm Mediterranean Sea, from the Atlantic coast of France to the very gates of Moscow. If Britain fell, democracy itself would die across the globe. Freedom would become just a distant memory. The light of Western civilization would be extinguished forever, leaving humanity in darkness for generations to come. Churchill picked up the phone, but what he said next shocked everyone who heard it, including his own cabinet members who were listening from the next room through the thin walls of the underground bunker, expecting to hear their leader finally accept the inevitable defeat that every expert had predicted. He didn't call Lord Halifax to discuss surrender terms. He didn't call Hitler's representatives waiting patiently in neutral Switzerland. Instead, Churchill dialed a number that would make Nazi Germany's blood run cold and change the course of World War II forever. He was calling President Roosevelt in Washington, but not to beg for help like every other European leader had done in their final desperate hours. He was about to make the most audacious demand in diplomatic history. The transatlantic connection crackled with static, each pop and hiss carrying the weight of civilization's future across 3,000 miles of dark ocean. Roosevelt's voice came through, tired and frustrated, heavy with the burden of watching democracy die across Europe. The American president had watched democracy die across Europe, had seen one ally after another fall to Hitler's unstoppable war machine, and he was expecting another desperate plea for rescue from yet another doomed leader. Mr. President, Churchill's voice boomed through the static with surprising strength that seemed to defy Britain's desperate military situation. I'm not calling to ask for your help. I'm calling to tell you what's going to happen. Britain will never surrender. We will fight on the seas and oceans. We will fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We will defend our island home, whatever the cost may be. Roosevelt interrupted, his voice heavy with the weight of watching Europe burn and expecting Britain to follow the same tragic pattern. Winston, be realistic. Your military situation is impossible. Even if you want to fight, you simply don't have the weapons, the men, or the equipment. Hitler has conquered everything from Norway to North Africa. What makes you think you can succeed where France, Poland, and every other democracy has failed so completely?
But Churchill's response sent chills down Roosevelt's spine and would later become the rallying cry that saved Western civilization from the abyss of totalitarian darkness. Mr. President, you're looking at this all wrong. We don't need to win tomorrow or next week or next month. We just need to not lose today. Every day we survive, Hitler gets weaker. Every day we fight, his empire cracks a little more. Time is on our side, not his, because tyranny contains the seeds of its own destruction. What Roosevelt didn't know, what even Churchill's own cabinet didn't fully understand, was that Churchill had spent the previous 72 hours studying not military reports filled with depressing statistics, but ancient history books. Ancient texts about island warfare, medieval accounts of siege defense, naval histories dating back to the Romans and Greeks. He had discovered something that would turn Britain's greatest weakness into its most powerful weapon against the Nazi war machine. Churchill had realized that throughout all of recorded history, spanning thousands of years of human warfare, no island nation had ever been successfully invaded when its people refused to give up. Not once. Not ever. The Spanish Armada had failed against Elizabeth's England despite overwhelming numerical superiority. Napoleon's Grand Army had never crossed the Channel despite controlling all of continental Europe. Even the Vikings, masters of sea warfare and amphibious assault, had eventually been driven back by determined island defenders who refused to accept defeat. But there was something else, something so secret that Churchill knew even his most trusted advisors would think him mad if they knew the full extent of his knowledge. Something that would make Hitler's invasion plans look like a child's game of toy soldiers. British intelligence, working in complete secrecy at the mysterious Bletchley Park facility, had just achieved what many thought impossible. They had cracked the German Enigma code, breaking the most sophisticated encryption system in military history. Churchill had seen Hitler's actual invasion plans, read German naval communications word for word, knew exactly when and where the Wehrmacht intended to strike. The Führer was planning to attack in exactly 47 days, but his plans had one fatal flaw that would ultimately destroy him. The intelligence reports spread across Churchill's desk told a story that Hitler himself didn't fully understand about his own crumbling empire. Germany's war economy was already showing dangerous cracks beneath its impressive facade. Steel production was falling behind military demand. Oil reserves were critically low and getting worse each month. Rationing was causing serious unrest in German cities, and the Nazi war machine was built for lightning victories, not prolonged campaigns that drained resources. But the most shocking revelation came from intercepted communications between Hitler and his increasingly nervous generals. The Nazi leadership was completely split on strategy. Some wanted to invade Britain immediately before winter made crossing impossible. Others wanted to focus on the Eastern Front and deal with Russia first. The delay was causing massive logistical problems, and German morale was beginning to crack under the immense pressure of preparing for the largest seaborne invasion in human history. Churchill smiled grimly as he read the intercepted message from German Admiral Raeder to Hitler, warning that the invasion of Britain would be an act of desperation that could destroy the entire German navy. Hitler's own commanders were terrified of crossing the English Channel, but they couldn't admit their fears without appearing weak to their tyrannical leader.
Hitler was counting on Britain to be reasonable, to negotiate like gentlemen, to accept defeat gracefully like every other European democracy had done when faced with overwhelming German force. The entire Nazi strategy depended on Churchill being logical, being afraid, being willing to trade freedom for survival like a rational politician. But Hitler had made the same catastrophic mistake that Napoleon made in 1805, the same mistake the Spanish made in 1588, the same mistake every tyrant makes when facing the British. They assumed that overwhelming force would automatically lead to surrender from a civilized nation. Churchill hung up the phone with Roosevelt and immediately called an emergency cabinet meeting that would determine the fate of human freedom. His voice over the internal communication system was calm but carried an undertone of steel that made every minister in the building stop what they were doing and listen with growing amazement. When his cabinet members arrived at the war room, expecting to discuss surrender terms and negotiate Britain's honorable capitulation, Churchill stood before them with fire in his eyes and delivered the speech that would define the next 5 years of human history. The underground chamber fell silent as Churchill rose from his chair with the bearing of a man who had made peace with his destiny. Maps of Europe covered the walls, showing German advances marked in red ink that looked like blood spreading across the continent. Every face in the room bore the exhaustion of defeat, the hollow look of men who had watched their world crumble in just a few short months of relentless German victories. "Gentlemen," Churchill began, his voice growing stronger with each word like thunder building before a storm, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. But I say to you, and I say it with absolute certainty that burns in my very soul, we shall never surrender." Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler's representatives in Switzerland, interrupted with barely controlled frustration. "Prime Minister, with all due respect, this is emotional thinking, not strategic thinking. We cannot win this war alone against the entire continent. France is gone, Poland is gone, Norway is gone. We are facing the entire continent of Europe united under Nazi rule. Mathematics doesn't lie. We simply don't have the resources to continue fighting this hopeless war." Churchill turned to face Halifax directly, and the smile that spread across his weathered face would haunt Hitler's dreams for the rest of his increasingly troubled life. It was the smile of a man who knew something that his enemies couldn't possibly understand, something that would shake the foundations of the Nazi Empire. "Lord Halifax, you're absolutely right about one thing. We cannot win this war alone. But we're not alone, and we never have been. We have something Hitler will never understand, something that has saved Britain for 1,000 years. We have time, and we have the sea, and we have the unbreakable will of free people who refuse to live as slaves.
What Churchill revealed next changed everything in that underground room and would ultimately change the course of world history. British intelligence had discovered that Hitler's seemingly invincible war machine was already running out of the three things it needed most: fuel, food, and time. The Nazi economy was like a massive bicycle. It could only stay upright by moving forward constantly, conquering new territories, stealing new resources. The moment it stopped expanding, it would collapse under its own crushing weight. But the real shock came when Churchill walked to his war room map and revealed his secret weapon, something so audacious that even his own cabinet couldn't believe what they were hearing from their prime minister. Churchill wasn't just planning to survive Hitler's invasion, he was planning to turn it into the greatest military trap in human history, using Britain itself as bait to destroy the entire German war machine in one decisive, crushing blow. The Prime Minister pointed to the English Channel with his cigar, his eyes gleaming with the kind of strategic brilliance that had made the British Empire the greatest power on earth for centuries. Gentlemen, when Hitler invades, and he will invade because he has no choice left, we're not just going to fight him on the beaches, we're going to let him land, let him commit his entire invasion force to British soil, and then we're going to slam the door shut behind him and destroy his army completely. The room fell into stunned silence as the implications sunk in. Churchill was proposing to use Britain itself as bait in the largest military trap in human history, deliberately allowing German forces to land on British beaches so they could be systematically encircled and annihilated. The genius of the plan was terrifying in its simplicity and devastating in its potential consequences. If it worked, Hitler would lose his entire invasion force, and Germany would be defenseless. If it failed, Britain would cease to exist as a free nation. Churchill's strategy was based on one brutal fact that he had learned from studying every successful island defense in recorded history. Hitler's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. The Nazi war machine was absolutely unstoppable when moving forward, crushing resistance with overwhelming force and lightning speed. But it was completely helpless when trapped, when its supply lines were cut, when it couldn't retreat back to safe territory. The English Channel would become Hitler's prison, and Britain would become his graveyard. German forces that landed on British beaches would find themselves cut off from resupply, surrounded by a population that refused to surrender, facing an enemy that knew every hill, every road, every hiding place in their homeland. The same water that brought them to Britain would prevent them from ever leaving alive. Over the next 47 crucial days, as German invasion barges gathered ominously in French ports, Churchill transformed Britain into something the world had never seen before: a fortress nation where every citizen became a soldier, every town became a battleground, every mile of countryside became a carefully prepared killing field for invaders. British factories that had been peacefully making cars and radios were now producing machine guns and ammunition around the clock. Housewives learned to make explosives in their kitchens using everyday materials. Farmers turned their peaceful fields into deadly tank traps. Even children practiced throwing Molotov cocktails and learned to recognize German aircraft. The entire British population, from aristocratic lords to working-class laborers, prepared to fight with a desperation and determination that shocked even Churchill himself. But most importantly, Churchill's words had reached every British home, every British heart, every British soul through his powerful radio broadcasts. His speeches didn't just inform the people about their situation, they transformed them completely. Ordinary citizens began to believe that they could face the most powerful army in history, and not just survive, but actually win. The psychological transformation was nothing short of miraculous, and would prove more powerful than any weapon. The same people who had been desperately demanding peace talks in May were enthusiastically building barricades in June. The same politicians who had called Churchill a dangerous warmonger were now competing to see who could be more defiant toward Hitler. Britain hadn't just decided to fight, they had decided that death with honor was infinitely preferable to life as slaves. When Hitler's invasion deadline came and went without any attack, the entire world began to realize what had actually happened. The man who had conquered all of Europe, who had crushed every army that stood against him, couldn't cross 21 miles of water because one British leader had refused to be reasonable, refused to be logical, refused to surrender when every expert said surrender was the only rational choice left. But the real miracle wasn't Britain's military defense. It was what Churchill's alliance inspired around the entire world. America saw that democracy could fight back effectively and began sending desperately needed weapons. Russia saw that Hitler could actually be stopped and started preparing their own massive defenses. Resistance movements across Nazi-occupied Europe saw that the German Empire could be successfully challenged and began sabotaging German operations everywhere. Hitler's empire, which had seemed absolutely invincible in May 1940, began to crack and crumble under the unexpected pressure of Britain's continued existence. German resources that should have been used to invade Russia were tied up indefinitely, preparing for an invasion of Britain that never came. German morale, which had been sky-high after the lightning conquest of France, began to falter seriously as the war dragged on month after month with no end in sight. The entire world watched in amazement as one man's 10-minute decision created a massive chain reaction that would ultimately topple Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. Churchill's refusal to surrender didn't just save Britain from Nazi occupation, it proved that totalitarian regimes, no matter how powerful they appear, contain the seeds of their own inevitable destruction when faced with absolute determination from free people. That historic phone call Churchill made to Roosevelt changed everything, but not in the way anyone could have expected at the time. It didn't bring immediate American help. It didn't provide British troops with weapons or supplies. What it did was infinitely more powerful. It announced to the entire world that freedom was still alive, that democracy would not go quietly into the night, that somewhere in the darkness of Nazi-occupied Europe, a bright light still burned defiantly. Churchill's decision in those 10 crucial minutes didn't just save Britain, it proved forever that sometimes the most powerful force in human history isn't armies or weapons
or brilliant strategies. Sometimes it's just one person who looks directly at impossible odds, faces the very real prospect of certain death, and says two simple words that echo through eternity: never surrender. Because in those 10 minutes, when the world's greatest democracy faced its absolute darkest hour, when every reasonable voice counseled immediate defeat, when cold logic demanded capitulation to superior force, one extraordinary man proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite overwhelming fear. And that single act of defiance can literally change the course of human civilization forever.